April 23, 1945. Klaus Becker was 16 years old, standing in a ruined Berlin street with a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket launcher on his shoulder, staring at a Soviet T-34 tank rolling toward him. If he pulled the trigger, he would either become a hero or just another dead child. He no longer knew which one he wanted to be. 2 weeks earlier, Klaus had believed in victory. 2 weeks earlier, he had believed in the Führer. 2 weeks earlier, he had been a boy. Now he was something else entirely. April 10th, 1945. The Soviet Red Army was 60 kilometers from Berlin. Klaus sat in his classroom at the gymnasium, trying to focus on mathematics while the distant rumble of artillery fire made the windows rattle. His teacher, Herr Schmidt, an old man with one arm, the other lost at Verdun in the previous war, had stopped pretending to teach weeks ago. "The Bolsheviks are coming," Schmidt said quietly, staring out the window. "God help us all." That afternoon, the Hitler-Jugend leader came to the school. His name was Hauptscharführer Vogel, 24 years old, with cold eyes and an iron cross on his chest. He stood before the assembled boys, 32 of them, ages 14 to 17, and gave them the news they'd been dreading and, in some strange way, expecting. "Gentlemen, the time has come to defend the fatherland. The Führer calls upon Germany's youth to stand against the Bolshevik hordes. You will report for military training tomorrow at 0600 hours. This is not a request. This is your duty." Klaus felt his stomach drop. Around him, some boys sat straighter, faces flushed with excitement. Others went pale. A few began to cry silently. When Klaus arrived home that evening, his mother was packing. Anna Becker was 38 years old, but looked 50. Her husband, Klaus's father, had died at Stalingrad 2 years ago. The telegram had been brief. "Fell in heroic defense of the fatherland." They never got a body. Just a medal and a photograph of a man Klaus was already forgetting. "We're leaving," his mother said without preamble. "Tonight, I have papers. We can go to your aunt in Bavaria." "I can't," Klaus said. "I've been called up. Training starts tomorrow." His mother's hands stopped moving. She turned to look at him, and in her eyes, Klaus saw something that terrified him more than any artillery fire. Absolute despair. "Klaus, the war is lost. Everyone knows it. The Americans are in the west, the Soviets in the east. Berlin will fall. If you stay, you will die." "I'm a German," Klaus said, though his voice shook. "I can't run." His 12-year-old sister Greta watched from the doorway, silent tears streaming down her face. Anna Becker stared at her son for a long moment, then she slapped him, hard. The sound echoed in the small apartment. "Your father said the same thing," she whispered, "and I never saw him again." But Klaus reported for duty the next morning anyway, because he was 16 and stupid and still believed that honor meant something. The training camp was in a park on the outskirts of Berlin. 3 days of instruction from exhausted Wehrmacht veterans who looked at the assembled boys and old men with barely concealed pity. Klaus was issued a uniform 3 sizes too large, a helmet that kept slipping over his eyes, and a Panzerfaust, a single-shot disposable anti-tank weapon that looked like a metal tube with a rocket attached. "It's simple," the instructor said. He was perhaps 45, with a bandage over one eye and a limp. "You get within 50 meters of the tank. You aim for the side or rear armor. You fire. 1 tank, 1 shot. For the Führer, for Germany." "What if we miss?" a boy asked. The instructor's good eye focused on him. "Then you die." "Next question?" They practiced on wooden mock-ups of Soviet tanks. They watched propaganda films showing heroic Hitler-Jugend boys destroying entire tank columns. They were told that 1 brave German boy was worth 10 cowardly Bolsheviks. They were not told that most boys who faced a T-34 tank never got a second shot. They were not told that the Soviets had learned to accompany their tanks with infantry specifically to kill Panzerfaust teams before they could fire. They were not told that the war was already lost, and they were being sent to die for a regime that was buying time measured in hours, not days. But as Klaus lay on his bunk that night, listening to the increasingly loud artillery fire, part of him understood. The older soldiers, the ones with dead eyes and trembling hands, they knew. They just couldn't say it out loud, because saying it out loud meant facing the firing squad. On April 16th, the Soviet assault on Berlin began in earnest. Klaus was in his defensive position, a pile of rubble that had once been an apartment building, when the bombardment started. It began at dawn, a rolling thunder that never stopped. The sky turned orange with explosions. The ground shook so hard that Klaus's teeth rattled. Dust and smoke filled the air until he couldn't see more than a few meters. The boy next to him, a 14-year-old named Peter, was praying. Vater unser, der du bist im Himmel. Klaus wanted to tell him that God had left Berlin a long time ago, but he said nothing. That evening, Klaus ran home during a lull in the fighting. The streets were chaos, rubble, fires, bodies. Soldiers retreating, civilians with blank faces, carrying suitcases containing whatever remained of their lives. His apartment building was still standing. Barely. The top 2 floors had been sheared off by a bomb. He climbed the stairs, which were covered in plaster and glass, and found his mother and sister in the cellar with a dozen other families. "Klaus!" Greta threw herself at him. She was crying. Everyone was crying. His mother held him silently, then pulled back to look at his uniform, his helmet, the rifle slung over his shoulder. "How many days until they're here?" she asked quietly. "Days?" Klaus almost laughed. "The Soviets are already in the suburbs. Maybe 2 days, maybe less. Then we leave tonight." "I can't. I have orders. If I don't return, they'll what?" His mother's voice was sharp. "Shoot you? Klaus, if you stay, you'll die anyway. At least this way you choose. If I run, they'll execute you for having a deserter son." It was true. The SS had begun hanging deserters from lamp posts throughout the city, with signs around their necks. I was a coward. Families of deserters were being shot. His mother closed her eyes. "Then go back." "But Klaus," she gripped his shoulders. "Survive. I don't care how. Survive and come back to us." That night was the last time Klaus saw his mother's face without blood on it. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, a bitter irony, the Soviets had penetrated deep into Berlin. Klaus's unit had been pushed back 3 times, leaving dead boys behind each time. Out of the 32 from his school, 11 were already dead. 4 were missing. The rest were scattered across various defensive positions, slowly being ground into nothing. Klaus found himself at a crossroads in the Mitte district with 12 other Hitlerjugend boys and their commander, Hauptmann Brandt, a veteran in his mid-40s with a bandaged head and a look of absolute fatigue. "They're coming," Brandt said, binoculars to his eyes. "T-34s, at least 6, infantry support." Klaus gripped his Panzerfaust. His hands were shaking. He'd fired one in training, never in combat, never at a real tank that could shoot back. "Remember," Brandt said, his voice hoarse, "wait until they're close, aim for the sides, and boys," he paused, "it's been an honor." The tanks appeared through the smoke like metal monsters, their engines roaring. Behind them, Soviet infantry in brown uniforms, rifles ready. "Hold! Hold!" Brandt whispered. 100 meters, 80, 60. Hans, the boy to Klaus's left, panicked. He stood up and fired his Panzerfaust at 70 meters. The rocket went wide, exploding against a building. The lead tank's turret swung toward them. "Down!" Brandt screamed. The tank's machine gun opened fire, a sound like the world being torn apart. Bullets chewed through the rubble. Klaus pressed himself flat, covering his head. When the firing stopped, he looked over. Hans was dead. So was the boy behind him, and the one behind him. 3 dead in 5 seconds. Klaus vomited. "Fall back!" Brandt was shouting. "Fall back!" They ran, through streets filled with smoke and fire, past burning vehicles, past bodies, past civilians who stared at them with hollow eyes. That night, Klaus understood something fundamental. This wasn't a war, it was an execution. They were lambs being sent to slow down wolves, and somewhere, in a bunker deep underground, leaders who would never hold a Panzerfaust were making speeches about heroic resistance. Klaus made his decision. He would desert. At midnight, he slipped away from his unit. The streets were dark, lit only by fires. Artillery fire had become so constant it was like thunder that never stopped. He made his way across the city, avoiding patrols, sticking to shadows. It took him 4 hours to reach his neighborhood. His building was damaged worse than before. The stairwell had partially collapsed. He climbed through rubble and made it to the cellar entrance. "Mama! Greta!" Silence. His heart pounded. He climbed down into the darkness, using a lighter for illumination. They were there. His mother was bandaged, her arm in a makeshift sling. Greta was beside her, pale but alive. "Klaus!" His mother's eyes filled with tears. "You came back." "We're leaving, now, all of us." "Klaus, you can't. If they catch you, I don't care. The war is over. Hitler is going to kill himself in a bunker and leave us all to die. I won't die for that. I won't let you die for that." He helped them gather what little they had. Some food, water, documents. They would head west toward the American lines. It was a long shot, but anything was better than staying. They made it 2 blocks. "Halt!" SS patrol, 3 men in black uniforms, with rifles and the dead eyes of fanatics. "Papers!" Klaus's heart sank. He was in uniform but had no authorization to be away from his unit. The SS sergeant looked at him, then at his mother and sister, then back at Klaus. "Deserter." "No, I was just—" "Shut up." The sergeant looked around, saw a tree, nodded to his men. "String him up." "No." Klaus's mother stepped forward. "Please, he's just a boy." "He's a traitor." The sergeant pulled out a length of rope. On trees along the street hung 5 other bodies, signs around their necks. Greta was sobbing. His mother was begging. Klaus felt a strange calm descend. This was it. 16 years old and about to be hanged in the ruins of Berlin for the crime of wanting to live. Then artillery fire exploded a block away. The ground shook. Dust and debris rained down. In the chaos, Klaus grabbed Greta and ran. His mother was right behind him. They sprinted down an alley as the SS men shouted and opened fire. Bullets sparked off brick walls. They dove into a collapsed building, crawling through rubble, and emerged 3 streets away. "Keep moving," Klaus gasped, but they couldn't go west now. The SS would be looking for them, and he couldn't return to his unit. He was now officially a deserter. "The cellar," his mother said. "We go back, we hide, we wait for the Soviets. The Soviets will kill us, maybe, but the SS definitely will." They made it back to the cellar and sealed themselves in with several other families. 2 days. They would hide for 2 days, until the Soviets passed through, but the SS found him first. The next morning, 2 SS soldiers and an officer came to the cellar. They were pulling boys and men out, checking papers, looking for deserters. Klaus tried to hide behind other people, but there were too few places to hide. "You, out." The SS officer was young, maybe 25, with a thin face and eyes that held no mercy. "You're Hitlerjugend. Why aren't you at your position?" I was injured. I was coming back." "Liar." The officer pulled out a list. "Klaus Becker, reported as missing from Unit 14. The penalty for desertion is death." Klaus's mother screamed. Greta clung to him. "I'll give you 1 chance," the officer said. "Return to the front line right now. Fight. If you die a hero. If you run again, we execute your entire family." Klaus looked at his mother, at his sister, at the gun pointed at his chest. "I'll go," he whispered. The SS soldiers dragged him out of the cellar, threw him into a truck with other boys who'd been rounded up, and drove them toward the sound of gunfire. Klaus was past fear now, past anger, past everything. He existed in a strange fog where nothing felt real. They dropped him at a defensive position near the Reichstag, the symbol of German government, now a fortress surrounded by rubble and corpses. His new commander was a major in his 50s, with a scarred face and one arm. He looked at the boys being delivered and shook his head slowly. "Children," he muttered. "They're sending me children." He distributed Panzerfausts and positioned them in the ruins. "When the tanks come, you fire. Aim for the tracks or the rear. Don't try to be heroes. Heroes are just corpses with better eulogies." Klaus took up position in a shell crater. Around him were 3 other boys, none older than 17. They didn't speak. What was there to say? The major sat down next to Klaus. "What's your name, son?" "Klaus. Klaus Becker." "How old?" 16. The major closed his eyes for a moment. "I have a son. Had a son. Your age. He died in France." Klaus said nothing. "You know we've lost, right?" The major's voice was barely a whisper. "It's over. Maybe another day. Maybe 2. Then the Soviets will be here and this madness ends." "Then why are we still fighting?" "Because the alternative is a bullet from the SS. Because we're soldiers and we follow orders. Because—" He trailed off. "I don't know anymore." The major stood up, wincing from some old wound. "Stay alive, Klaus. That's an order. When it ends, surrender to the Russians if you can. They'll send you to a camp, but you'll live. Better a live prisoner than a dead hero." Those were the last words of wisdom Klaus received from a sane adult. At 3 p.m. on April 23rd, the Soviet tanks came. Klaus watched them through a gap in the rubble. 6 T-34s, infantry spread out behind them. The tanks fired as they advanced, pulverizing buildings that were already ruins. "Hold positions!" someone shouted. The tanks were 100 meters away. Then 80, then 60. The boy next to Klaus, his name was Ernst, he was 15, stood up with his Panzerfaust. "Not yet," Klaus hissed. But Ernst was beyond hearing. He aimed, fired. The rocket streaked across the gap and slammed into a T-34's front armor. It bounced off. The tank didn't even slow down. Its main gun swung toward them and fired. The shell hit the rubble 20 meters away. The explosion threw Klaus backward. His ears rang. He tasted blood. When his vision cleared, Ernst was gone. Just gone. Where he'd been standing was a crater. 50 meters now. The tanks were unstoppable, grinding forward. Klaus gripped his Panzerfaust. His hands were steady now. Fear had been replaced by cold clarity. He stood up, aimed at the lead tank's side armor, and pulled the trigger. The rocket shot forward, a streak of fire and smoke. It hit the tank just below the turret. The explosion was deafening. Flames erupted from the tank's hatches. It shuddered to a stop. Klaus had killed a tank. He'd also signed his own death warrant. The other tanks opened fire. Machine guns and main guns. The ruins around Klaus disintegrated into dust and fire. He dove for cover, crawling through rubble as bullets chewed the ground around him. Someone was screaming. Maybe him. He couldn't tell. He crawled into a crater and pressed himself flat. Above him, the world was ending. He thought about his mother, about Greta, about his father, dead in Stalingrad, about Hans and Ernst and Peter and all the other boys whose names he'd never know. He thought about Hitler in his bunker, probably sitting at a desk, probably drinking wine, definitely not holding a Panzerfaust in a crater while Soviet tanks tried to kill him. And Klaus Becker, 16 years old, made a decision. He wasn't dying here. He waited until the tanks passed, waited until the Soviet infantry was focused forward. Then he slid backward through the rubble, moving like a snake, until he was in the ruins of a building. He stripped off his Hitlerjugend tunic, keeping only a white undershirt. He dropped his rifle, kept only a knife hidden in his boot. Then he ran, not toward German lines, not toward SS patrols, not toward any authority that would put him back in a crater with a Panzerfaust. He ran toward the cellar where his family hid. Behind him, the battle raged. The Reichstag was being destroyed. The Third Reich was having its dying convulsion, and Klaus Becker ran through smoke and fire, a deserter, a coward by Nazi standards, but alive. He reached the cellar at dusk. Explosions lit the sky. The artillery fire had reached a fever pitch. The Soviets were making their final push. "Klaus!" His mother's embrace was desperate. "We're leaving," he said. "Now, tonight, the front line is collapsing. In the chaos, we can slip through." "Where will we go?" "West, toward the Americans. It's our only chance." They gathered what little they had. Klaus found a white sheet and tore it into strips. When the Soviets came, they would wave white flags and surrender. Better to be alive in a Soviet prison camp than dead in the rubble of Berlin. They emerged from the cellar into a nightmare. Berlin was burning. The entire sky glowed orange. Buildings collapsed with regularity. Screams echoed from every direction. They moved through back alleys, avoiding main streets where fighting still raged. Twice they had to hide as Soviet soldiers passed. Once they saw SS officers executing German soldiers who'd tried to surrender. Klaus kept his family moving. Greta was crying silently, stumbling with exhaustion. His mother was praying under her breath. They reached a park, or what had been a park. Now it was a wasteland of craters and burning trees, and there, blocking their path, were Soviet soldiers, 5 of them, rifles raised. Klaus immediately raised his hands, motioning for his mother and sister to do the same. He'd prepared a few words in Russian, learned from a dictionary he'd found in the ruins. "Niet, niet, surrender, family." The soldiers approached cautiously. One was an officer, a lieutenant with a hard face and cold eyes. He said something in Russian Klaus didn't understand. Klaus pointed to himself, then to his mother and sister. "Family, neat soldier, neat shoot." The soldiers conferred, briefly. Then the lieutenant nodded, gestured with his rifle. "Idite." They were prisoners now. The Soviets marched them to a makeshift collection point where hundreds of other Germans, soldiers and civilians, sat under guard. They were searched, their few possessions taken, and pushed into a corner. Klaus held Greta close. His mother was silent, staring at nothing. They were alive. In the distance, gunfire still echoed. The battle for Berlin would rage for another week. Hitler would commit suicide on April 30th. On May the 2nd, the city would formally surrender. But for Klaus Becker, the war ended on April the 23rd, 1945, in a ruined park, becoming a prisoner of the Red Army. He was 16 years old. He'd killed 1 tank and saved his family. Years later, people would ask him if he regretted deserting, if he felt like a coward. Klaus's answer was always the same. "I regret that I was ever put in a position where a 16-year-old boy had to choose between dying for a lie or living as a coward. But do I regret choosing life? No, never." He spent 3 years in a Soviet labor camp. His mother and sister were separated from him, but survived. When they were finally released in 1948, they made their way to West Germany and tried to rebuild lives from the ashes. Klaus never spoke much about those final days in Berlin. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he would wake up screaming, back in that crater, watching tanks roll toward him while boys around him died. The war had lasted 12 years for Germany. For Klaus, it lasted 13 days, from April the 10th, when he was called up, to April the 23rd, when he surrendered. 13 days that aged him 30 years. He lived to be 83. He had children and grandchildren. He became a teacher, educating new generations about the dangers of fanaticism and the value of questioning authority. But part of him never left Berlin. Part of him was still 16, standing in rubble with a Panzerfaust, watching tanks approach and wondering if honor was worth more than life. He'd chosen life. And every day after, he had to live with both the shame of that choice in the eyes of some and the profound relief that he'd made it. Because in the end, Klaus Becker understood something that took Germany years to accept. There is no glory in dying for a lost cause. There is no honor in being cannon fodder for madmen. There is only survival, and the responsibility to remember, so that no other 16-year-old boy ever has to make that choice. Berlin fell. The Reich collapsed. The war ended. And Klaus Becker, deserter, coward, survivor, lived to tell the story.